So thus, I've labeled this today, The Power of Personal Story, and really the subheading, Know Your Story, and, the big emphasis, and lead with it. How do you come to know your story, and how do you use it as a resource for you? And all of you are in a doctoral educational leadership program, so I hope this is relevant to you. So that's the context. It's probably important because here you sit as doctoral learners on the cusp of beginning this journey, particularly around your dissertation. And I want to share with you a little bit about my journey. I don't know if anyone recognizes this building. It's just about an hour and a half or 2 hours away from here on the Ohio State University campus. It's Orton Hall, and it's the geology library at Ohio State University. And I remember back about 1980, Dr. Gary McKenzie, in an environmental geomorphology class that I took. I was a geology and mineral economics major at Ohio State in my undergrad. And I remember we were next door in this building over here, Mendenhall Lab. The bell rang, and he looked at us and he said, "Everyone pack up your books, put them away." So we all packed up our stuff into our backpacks. And he said, "Follow me." And we just walked across over into this building. And you can probably tell it's a stunningly beautiful building architecturally, probably one of the most beautiful on campus. We walked inside in these beautiful wooden mahogany kind of dark paneled walls, fireplace, the big tables with the banker's lamps. And we got in there and he said, "Here's where we're going to spend this semester." And of course we all kind of looked at each other because this was a field course, and as geologists, geology happens out there in the field, not in here in the classroom, so we were all a bit speculative about what is he saying here. And he said, "We're going to spend our time in here with these things." And as he waved his hand, he was referring to this beautiful artwork that was on the walls. And of course, being a poor kid from Appalachia who never had really interacted with art, I was even more skeptical at this point. We spent the rest of that semester studying environmental geomorphology, the study of the Earth's landscapes, by studying art, by studying these beautiful paintings on the wall. And what he helped us understand is that early geologists often employed artists to go west with them in their exploration because they didn't have the technology that we have today. These artists would produce these beautiful artworks that hung on the wall because they told a story. They told the story about mineral reserves. They told the story about challenges of extracting those minerals. They told the story of the landscape and the riches that may lay there. That to me was a turning point. Here I was studying the science of geology, and out of left field, Dr. Gary McKenzie, a Canadian I should add, threw this curveball of interesting sort of look at geology that it might have something to do with art, it might have something to do with story. That was a place that I really grabbed hold of. However, when I graduated, I spent about the next 10 years working for an Australian-based mining company, doing very technical kind of things. And it wasn't until I came to a decision point of should I go on and get a master's degree? And I really reflected and I thought, do I go back and get a master's in geology? Do I do an MBA? What do I do? And I really thought, you know what, for 10 years, I really wasn't in love with the science of geology. I was in love with this aesthetic way of knowing, particularly of knowing landscapes. And that's what I worked in as an environmental geologist with this mining company. It became clear to me that my passion was really around this aesthetic way of knowing, the stories in the landscape, not so much with the science. If you fast forward a few years, I'm then going back for a doctorate. This piece here, I don't know if you can see it real well, but it looks like some sort of an executive sitting at his or her desk. And it kind of looks like a museum setting here, doesn't it? People sort of peering into the executive of what's going on, like we kind of peer, like you may have with Anu at the museum a couple days ago. Even a little descriptor here on the wall. We can only imagine what that descriptor says about the executive sitting there. I cut this out, I think of the New Yorker, maybe about 25 years ago. But it reminded me of that interest that I had, that I rediscovered when I went back for my doctorate. Because what I ended up investigating in my doctoral work was a CEO of a bank, Dennis Evans. who was CEO of First Bank System, then one of the top 5 biggest banks in the US, based in Minneapolis. Dennis Evans had invested over $10 million in their corporate art collection, not just because it was a good investment, but it was right around the time of banking deregulation. And Dennis Evans knew he needed to change the bank. And when I interviewed him, he said, Nick, as CEO, he said, we had no idea what was going to happen in the banking industry, what changes were going to come. We couldn't imagine that this thing called the ATM was going to be invented, that we were going to have to be open for Saturday hours and all these other things. He said, but I knew it meant big change. So he essentially shifted the corporate artwork from what I call Art Deco. You know what I'm talking about? Those safe pastoral scenes of geese flying out over wetlands, which is kind of what dominated their Minneapolis headquarters. And he brought in a very provocative, postmodern sort of art. The one piece that I most vividly remember, a piece by Andre Serrano called Piss Elegance. Essentially, it showed a crucifix displayed in the jar of urine. If you can't imagine that offending Midwest sensibility, what else would? That was the kind of stuff that he used to provoke the people in the workplace to begin talking to one another. He understood that art was a vehicle for enabling conversations. Again, I was drawn back to this understanding of my own passion around story and how artwork can enable that storytelling. I share that with you because you're sitting here today thinking about your passions, about where you've come from, what interests you. Even a few of you I've talked with at lunch, and you're talking about these amazing intersections. I want to connect this and this. That's what I was doing back then. Today I've been able to figure out how to make this part of my life so it's not like work is here and this passion's over here. But today I try to weave together art, story, and the work I do in organizations. But I also share it with you so you can appreciate as we talk here today what frames my interest and why am I talking about stories the way I do. But I also have an incredible interest in the arts, specifically in the arts. And is there some way of thinking about the art of leadership or arts and organization? I'm going to ask you to play a game with me here, if you would. This game looks something like this. I'm going to give you an artist, and I'm going to ask you to tell me what that artistic output of that specific artist is. It's much simpler than it appears, maybe until we get to the end. So for example, and feel free to just shout this out, and even if you're at home, shout it out. I'll keep a good ear out for you. So the artist of a musician, what is her artistic output? Music. Yeah, of course. So the musician's artistic output is music. The playwright, his artistic output? Plays, yeah, a script and a play. What about, for example, a sculptor? Her artistic output? Sculpture. Sculpture, you know how this goes. Yes. Now, what about a leader?
Leaders.
Well, we often talk about leader as an artist. Metaphorically, we talk about it. There's a whole lot of research today into this notion that a leader is an artist. If that's so, what is her artistic output? It's interesting how quickly you went through those others and you were very able to tell me what that person's artistic output is.
Leaders.
Example, lead by example. Yeah. What else?
Leaders or leadership.
Leadership.
Yeah.
Followers.
Followers, of course.
We have social transformation from Kim Harris.
Social transformation, yeah, so think of this creative process of a leader is transforming something. Proteges, so others who come along with you or behind you to carry on the work. Isn't it interesting? I mean, those are varied responses. I don't know that we could kind of hone in on something, but yet very quickly you know that a musician produces music, a playwright produces plays, a sculptor produces sculptures. Well, what is it then if we want to talk about a leader being an artist? What is it that she does? Here's the proposition I want to leave you with today, because this is going to frame where I go. So I'm going to ask you to kind of suspend judgment and play along with me. Here's what I believe. That if an organization is constructed from language, so I'm making visible my assumptions here. I'm a bit of a social constructionist, if you want to talk about the theory. In other words, if an organization is constructed from language, That is, we talk it into existence, and change also occurs that way. Then creating discourse is essentially the creative act of leaders. Because I would challenge all of you, has anyone ever seen an organization? Has anyone ever put their hands on an organization? Of course not. Organization is a metaphor, right? But yet we tend to anthropomorphize it as if, you know, oh, IBM, it's that thing over there, like we can go over and put our arms around it. We might be able to hug the people, we might be able to touch the brick of the buildings, but the organization, IBM, it's a metaphor for how we organize those people, and we talk it into existence. At least that's what I believe in terms of a social constructionist view. So today I'm going to ask you to believe this proposition that a leader's work, if we think of her as an artist, is in creating discourse. Now, to bring it to a much more kind of applied or practical sort of level, who do you think said this? I had to know and understand my own story. The emphasis is mine. My own story before I could listen to and help other people with theirs. Who does that sound like that might have come from?
You.
Good guess.
Steve Jobs.
Sounds like someone smart, right? A Steve Jobs, a Socrates. I don't know, I'd put me in that category. But yeah, it sounds kind of profound. It's our President of the United States. I had to know and understand my own story before I could listen to and help other people with theirs. Now, he's probably never thought of himself in terms of a social constructionist. He's probably never thought of himself in terms of someone whose job is to create discourse. But I think he's embodying that when you hear these words. I had to know and understand my own story. And that's where I want to go today with you, how important it is for us as human beings, not just doctoral learners, to know our own story. Because to take Barack Obama's advice here, then we can listen to and help others. But we first have to know our own story. Now, we're talking about personal story here, but I first want to just playfully pull on a little thread over here around story in business. Dennis McKnight runs a company up in Alberta, Canada, where I spent 5 years before coming here to Cincinnati, called The Innovators. Essentially, it's a consulting company that helps people think through challenges. He took a group of agribusiness people up in Alberta to Italy because they were interested in food marketing challenges. And of course, where better to study food marketing than Italy, right? So they go to Italy, they kind of do this sort of industrial field trip, benchmarking in Italy. They come back, and Dennis McKnight said these words that I'm going to share with you to Alberta Venture, Alberta's business magazine. And here's what he had to say, and listen to it in terms of the message about the power of story in business. You all know this implicitly, but listen to what he says. He says, every place we went, referring to their trip in Italy, there was a story behind the product and the company. If you don't have a story, then you're a commodity. And if you're a commodity, then the only thing that matters is price. By a story, I mean, what are you doing that sets yourself apart? If you have a good story that ties into your product, you can charge more for it. Now, this is a very capitalist sort of business orientation to story. And as much as I, at first, kind of cringed at this, think about our own lives. Why do I go shopping at Findlay Market and pay a little bit more for the fresh greens? Well, I know they're grown in an urban garden, and I want to support that social justice initiative that's growing in there. Why do you go to certain stores to buy certain products? Because of freshness, because of eco concerns, because of social justice concerns. Because they've told a story to you that you tend to believe in about that. It isn't right or wrong, but it is the way this sort of unfolds in business. This is not where we're going today. We're not going to talk about stories in business. But I do want to acknowledge how we do that. And in fact, we have fields called marketing and branding and whatnot that do a lot of work with stories in business. Today, I want to talk to you about the power of personal story. Might bleed over into business stories, but not as simply a tool that's going to help you better market or manage your brand, your business. It's more about you. So the power of personal story. And probably the best way I can do that is to share with you a personal story, kind of one of my first real interactions with the power of personal story. It happened about 15, 20 years ago when I was adjuncting at Antioch. I had a corporate day job, but I found out that I loved teaching, and thus I was drawn to this role at Antioch. I was out in Seattle the week before my Saturday class and had a very hectic, busy week. I took a red-eye back that I remember got me into Columbus about 6 a.m., and I needed to be back in Yellow Springs for a 9 a.m. class. So I went straight from the airport out to Yellow Springs to my class. And I remember walking in the class, and I was a young, not so experienced teacher, a little green in terms of my thinking about what I was supposed to be doing in that class. And of course, what I was doing was standing up here, putting things on a flip chart, because that's the important stuff, right before class, getting all those things on the flip chart, the whiteboard, whatever. And I was doing that. And as I stood here, doing things on the flip chart, my back was to the class. But every time I would turn around to make sure I was capturing my notes correctly, I noticed a woman who was trying to make eye contact with me. But I was busy. I was trying to get this stuff up here. And I was thinking, boy, I hope she doesn't come up because I'm not going to be able to get this done by time. And we kind of awkwardly sort of exchanged glances as I was doing this. Because again, I thought the important stuff was what I was doing there. Finally, we did make eye contact. And it was very clear that I needed to engage with her. And she walked up, and she kind of positioned herself so that her back was to the class, so that they couldn't see what she was going to share with me. And we kind of turned this way, away from the class. And she said, Dr. Nissley, I just want to let you know, she said, if I fall asleep in class today, it has nothing to do with you. She said, I loved the class last week. We only had one class meeting. It was the prior week. And she said, I really enjoyed what we did last week. What I had done with them was juggling. I really enjoyed juggling, and I think there's a metaphor there about the work we do as leaders, and I engaged them in learning how to juggle as part of the class work we were doing that week. And she said, I just really, really loved that juggling thing. I said, well, thank you. I said, tired, what's going on? She said, I had a red eye last night from San Francisco. And she said, I just got in and I'm really tired. And I thought I could just say, oh, okay, don't worry about it. Let me get back to this. And when you're having a conversation and a story's emerging, there was something that was pulling us closer. And I knew she had something she had to share with me. And I said, Sheila, what took you to San Francisco? She said, a funeral. She said, my brother passed away Monday after our class last week. And I realized, wow, I need to be present for this conversation. This stuff doesn't matter as much anymore. What she went on to share, she said, my mother and father didn't attend the funeral. She said, my brother was gay. He was shunned by our family. She said, I still loved and cared. We had a warm relationship. But she said my mother and father just have never been able to accept it. In fact, they said they couldn't attend the funeral. He died of AIDS after about 3 weeks in hospice. She knew it was coming. She said, nevertheless, it was very difficult. She said, so I was out there for the funeral. And she said, I just need to share something with you. And I don't think she used the word story, but she shared a story. I said, what is it? And she kind of teared up as she told me this, and she said, when I went to the viewing, she said, after everyone left, she said, I walked up to my brother's casket, and I remembered when I was 13 years old, he knew how to juggle, and I didn't. And she said, he used to tease me. He would tease me all the time about not knowing how to juggle. She said it was that brotherly sister kind of thing. It wasn't, mean. but she said, I've always wanted to learn how to juggle. And she said, I thought at some point in my life he'd show me, but he kind of went his way, I went my way. We never came back to that. But he knew how to juggle and I didn't. And she said, I opened up my coat, and on the inside pocket I had brought my juggle balls along. And she said, I went up to the casket and I juggled for my brother. And she said, I know he was smiling. I know he was probably laughing out loud at this. And she said, it just meant so much for me to be able to share with my brother that I had learned this finally. For me, there was something there, and I still, even 15 years later, I keep coming back to that. There's something I'm supposed to be getting from it. And I think each year I kind of pull a little bit more out of what it is I'm supposed to be getting from that. But she had something very personal to share with me. It didn't relate to organizational culture, which is the class we were talking about. It related to something very personal that she had to share. That to me was a time when I began to sort of appreciate my role as an instructor, as a professor, as something more than someone just purveying content. That there was a relationship that's built there, and those relationships are built through story. It was a turning point for me, personally understanding the power of story. Now let me connect this to something else. My doctoral work was in organizational culture. For the last 25 years, anthropologists have been split. The physical anthropologists believe that we should be named what? What is our genus and species name? Homo sapiens. And what does that refer to? How does that translate? Most of us don't remember, do we, back to what does that, kind of these sentient beings, we're upright walking, all these things that kind of maybe sell us short a bit. And in fact, the cultural anthropologists differ very much with the physical anthropologists. And there's been an argument of sorts saying, well, maybe we should be referred to as this. This is what distinguishes us from all those other creatures. But even if you don't remember your Latin, what does that refer to? Narrative. That we're these storytelling creatures. That's what differentiates us from all the other beings. Homo narrans. When I think back to Sheila in that classroom, there was something profound and intimate between us and her sharing that story. Something that might speak to the Homo narrans aspect of us. And in fact, do you know Garrison Keillor? Like I said, I spent the last 5 years up in Canada. If I'd ask anyone, nobody in the room knew Garrison Keillor. So I'd always have to use the Canadian equivalent, Stuart McLean, who you probably don't know. But there's sort of a Canadian equivalent to Garrison Keillor, Stuart McLean. But Garrison Keillor, I'm going to share with you some words that he shared. He never used the word homo narrans, but I think he's able to capture the essence of just how important story is in our lives. And here's what he has to say. He says, each person, I would say each and every one of us in this room, has a large secret life, dreams and stuff we don't know how to tell yet. And if we're in a family or community or a doctoral program whom we can't tell our stories to, then we're just really not related. We're just polite strangers sitting down to dinner. Maybe think back to Thursday or those other parties you've been to where we're often polite strangers. Sometimes we choose to be polite strangers. But think of that feeling of being polite strangers. He says we're all more complicated than we appear to be, even the ones whom everyone makes fun of or pities. I don't think he's beckoning us back to our junior high days. This happens to us today in the workplace, doesn't it? Those ones we make fun of or pity. And he says all we ask, all we need, is the chance to say our piece and tell who we are. I think he captures something there. All we need is the chance to say our piece and tell who we are. I just think about you sitting here today. I imagine for many of you, either consciously or unconsciously, part of getting a doctoral degree is being able to say your piece. It's being able to say, this is who I am. That I can be heard, I need to be listened to, I've got something to say. And that doctoral credential is probably going to help you be more recognized, more credible. It's going to make your voice have more impact. I think this is the stuff that Garrison Keillor's getting at. All we need is that chance to say our piece and tell who we are. Not who someone else thinks we are, not who someone else has labeled us as, but who we are through our voice. So you've got this notion of Garrison Keillor and the cultural anthropologist, homo narrans, that story is really important. In fact, we might even be hardwired for it. You have that on one hand. Let me also share with you, has anyone heard of narrative medicine? I like when I can share new ideas. Narrative medicine. Let me just ask, if you had to intuit what narrative medicine might be about, what do you think narrative medicine might have to deal with? Maybe hypnotizing? Maybe. What else?
The story of your health.
Story of your health?
Story of your life.
Story of your life. Yeah, not just your health. Let me draw a thread through some of these responses. Just like today, we've got super specialties in medicine like pediatric oncology. Another super specialty has been emerging called narrative medicine. Over the last 25 years, this has become a sort of respected institution within the medical arena. And in fact, Columbia University, last year in the New Yorker magazine, or actually 2 years ago, April 2009, had a full-page advertisement. And here you can see part of that. So Columbia University, a renowned Ivy League institution, is now offering a master's degree, an MS, in narrative medicine. Because the research, and I'm going to distill this and hopefully not oversimplify it, but the research, which is now carried out in like the Journal of the American Medical Association, New England Journal of Medicine, this is reported out. But what they found is that physicians and healthcare professionals who are better able to elicit stories from their patients, what can they do better? Diagnose and treat. Now, you told me you didn't know anything about narrative medicine. But this kind of intuitively makes sense, doesn't it? If I'm a healthcare professional and I'm treating you as my patient, if I'm better able to elicit your story about your health, about your life, intuitively it would seem that I should be better able to diagnose and treat. Now, without getting into exact numbers, we know that healthcare economics in the U.S. cost us roughly $1 squillion a year, right? So think, if you improve a physician's ability to diagnose by even 0.5%, by giving her the skills to better able to elicit stories, 0.5% improvement on diagnosing and treating of $1 squillion is something with a whole lot of zeros, right? In other words, I think there's a profound financial impact in the medical arena, let alone the healthcare outcomes, people being well. Columbia University has identified this, and in fact, 2 years ago has launched this new Master of Science in Narrative Medicine. Now, why do I share that with you? Because I usually scan and watch these things that are happening on the edges. And to me, this is one of those things that's happening on the edge. And it tells me that there's something profound that people have begun to pay attention to about the power of story and its impact in our own human health. So I wonder, if this applies in the medical arena, does this have any import to us in education? How so?
If we're better able to understand our students, and we're better able to serve them.
Yeah, in a simple way, if we're better able to understand our students, if we're better able to listen to their stories, elicit their stories, and then respond to those stories, our interventions might be more effective, right?
Absolutely.
I think so too. I don't know that, that's my hunch. But I share this with you because I think it is something we need to be paying attention to as educational leaders. There's something happening there.
Nowadays, a lot of people, non-traditional people, are going back to school. So with the changes in higher education, the narrative approach of offering non-traditional ways for people to go back to school. So it's like the research has been done to show that people need a different method to go back to school because they have full-time jobs and everything like that. So in a sense, this has already been done.
Absolutely. And in fact, many of you will probably engage in your dissertation research. It might involve a methodology of narrative. In the last 25 years, that has come to be an accepted qualitative approach. Narrative methodology. Listening to people's stories. And what do those stories tell us about their needs and how we might help them? Absolutely. So it's interesting. Homo narrans, this importance of stories in our lives. We even see very practical master's programs at Columbia University being founded. However, on one hand, Homo narrans, stories are important. Narrative medicine. But there's some tug or pull over here. Something that's saying, nah, that's story stuff, not so much. In fact, there's been a word coined, de-storification. It's a powerful word, isn't it? Can you see it there? I'm going to share with you what someone who coined this has to say about it. But it kind of hints at getting rid of stories, right? They're just stories. We've heard that before, haven't we? So here, Richard Stone, who coined the word, said, just as clear-cutting an old-growth forest leads to a phenomenon called deforestation. You all have a visual image in your head when we talk about deforestation. He says that's the stripping of the landscape of more than just trees. He says our culture has also been devastated by the loss of storytelling. Our culture has also been devastated by the loss of storytelling as a tool for communicating, passing on values, learning, and most important, healing. That's what we were just talking about with Columbia University in narrative medicine. He says when you cut down the trees, you also destroy the multitude of microenvironments in which a host of other living creatures make their home. And so it is with de-storification, he says. Now let me ask you, let's make this very practical. He's saying in deforestation, when we cut down the trees, we're not just cutting down trees. He's saying there's a whole lot of other microenvironments that are affected. And I think most of us who kind of accept a systems approach to ecology would say that makes sense. Well, does the analog make sense? Suppose we work in a workplace where stories aren't valued. In fact, our boss tries to discourage us from going for coffee in the afternoon because it's idle chat. It's that water cooler talk. It's that stuff where rumors happen. We don't want people sharing that kind of stuff. We might work in environments like that now. We might even unconsciously contribute to environments like that in our own workplace. But what Richard Stone is saying is that if we work in a workplace like that and our boss prohibits us from sharing stories, something more than just the hot air that's moving back and forth right now is missing. What else gets lost if we don't tell stories at work? Relationships, absolutely. Because every Monday morning when I come to work and I see you, and your name again? D. I see D first thing Monday morning, I say, hi D, and what are the next words out of my mouth? How was your weekend? It's an invitation for intimacy. It's an invitation for relationship. And she doesn't give me a spreadsheet, does she? She doesn't say, here's what I did this weekend. We engage in a story. She tells me about her child's soccer game. She tells me about the elder care with her mother. She tells me about the joys, the hopes, the sorrows. We share story back and forth. So relationship. What else is lost? We work in a workplace where stories aren't encouraged. What else will be lost? Identity. Absolutely. Because we shape our identity through story. In fact, at lunchtime, someone said, so how's your family doing? I said, oh, my daughter, she's beginning to train for a 5K. I'm probably not conscious about it, but I'm shaping my identity as a father who cares about his daughter. Now, we usually don't consciously think through these things, but I'm shaping through story my identity. that I want to project out there as a caring father. So relationship, identity. What else?
Communication.
Communication. Yeah, because we communicate through story. It's not the spreadsheets. It's not the facts. It's not the bullets. Nick, how was your weekend? 3 bullets, right? Or let me share the PowerPoint with you. Shame on me, huh? But we communicate in story. So relationship, identity, communication. What else bubbled up here?
Value. Value.
Value. Values.
Value, because you may not value your job as much if it's so robotic.
Yeah.
You know, you look forward to coming to work if you have a closer relationship with your.
Yeah, it's that thread that we pull together that all of us are part of this thing called Union Institute and University. It's that thread that we pull together. This is what makes us proud as this community, as this tribe. We share stories. In fact, Monday morning, as the learners, you're going to have stories that you're sharing online about, oh my gosh, remember that course on Saturday, or boy, we did this thing on Sunday. And the faculty are going to have stories about, oh, remember this, woman in the class, remember what this guy said. I'm going to be sharing stories. I think Richard Stone is onto something here. Challenge to you as educators, the challenge to us as educators, is to stop destorification. If you're looking for an activist platform around story, stop destorification. We've got to build workplaces where stories are valued, respected, encouraged, that people are listened to and heard and acted upon. So on one hand, homo narrans. On the other hand, destorification. I'm going to take us on a little bit of a tangent here, but I'll come back. Because again, I want to personalize this. So when we think about destorification, sometimes we've forgotten stories about our lives. Sometimes we've intentionally forgotten stories. Sometimes we've reshaped stories. But we have an opportunity to remember our stories. And you can see there's an intentional hyphenation there. Remembering our stories. That there's members in our stories. After today, there's some new members in my story. The doctoral program at Union Institute and University. Faculty, students, administrators. You're now members in my story. I thought about this as I was thinking of what to share with you here about remembering. Some neat idea that comes out of narrative therapy, David White's work, if you're familiar. Can you tell what that is? Can you see well enough that image up there? Some type of industrial factory. In fact, it's the Bethlehem Steel Corporation in Steelton, Pennsylvania. The Bethlehem Steel Corporation looks probably like its stereotype of steel factory, right? In fact, my father worked his whole life there, almost 30-some years, in and out of work there. Because as I'll share a little bit later, my father struggled with demons of alcohol and other things that put him in and out of prison. But he did always find his way back here. And he had one of those wonderful jobs that only an HR organization could classify. He had the job that was called unskilled laborer. Wouldn't that inspire you to wake up and go to work every day? Yeah, an unskilled laborer. It was a label, right? Because my father didn't have a high school education. He didn't have a technical trade. So he found his way in somewhat, a youthful time, and was able to work in the factory, but as an unskilled laborer. And if the company was equally unjust in giving him that title, he returned the unjustness in terms of his engagement and commitment. He didn't like the place he worked. He made it known to me every time he came home, and he did everything he could to sabotage the company also. In fact, as I remember, in 7th grade, my father, usually before noon, would have a quart of Budweiser. And I remember one day getting in an old blue rusty pickup truck with him, with that quart of Budweiser planted between his legs, as we drove into Steelton, about 20 minutes from where we lived. And we went somewhere out on the back of the property where there was a huge rail siding. Hundreds, thousands of rail cars would come into the factory every day. And we would always take along 3 things with us. We would take along a bolt cutter. You know what that is? You remember in junior high when you couldn't remember your lock combination? The janitor would come and do this. So we had a pair of bolt cutters. And we also had a chainsaw. And we'd let ourselves in somewhere out on the back side of the property using the bolt cutters on the fence to allow ourselves in. And we would find our way up alongside a rail car. And again, we usually have to use those bolt cutters on a lock on the car on the rail door. And then my job was always inside the car, and my father was outside. And inside the rail car, there were pallets, wooden pallets, stacked with stuff. I can't tell you what the stuff was because it was unimportant. My job was to push that stuff off the pallets. And then I would reach down and take the pallets and throw them out of the car to my father who had a chainsaw. He would cut those pallets into nice uniform pieces and we'd stack them in the back of the pickup truck. What was my father doing? We'll come back to that. We'll come back to that. What were we stealing? Firewood. Yeah. You know, this was about 35 years ago, and I recently, thanks to the internet, did some research. And I found that a half cord of wood that probably would have fit in the back of our pickup truck back on that time in 1977 was about $35 to $40. It was that important that we steal that because my dad obviously didn't have $35 or $40. That the trailer that we lived in was run by a wood stove. And that was how we heated. Now, to someone's point here, I wasn't the smartest 7th grader, but I did have a Pennsylvania civics class that year. And I remember learning about civics and stealing and those sorts of things. And you could probably gather my dad wasn't the kind of guy that you'd have this conversation with. But I often would roll my eyes or huff because I knew I was doing something illegal. So I remember once asking my father, is it okay that we're doing this? And I remember him stopping the chainsaw and looking at me right in the eyes. And he said, if the bastards would have given your old man a quarter in the last negotiation, he wouldn't have to be doing this for you today. What he was talking about is the quarter that didn't get added to his salary or to his earnings at the last union negotiation. The way my dad made sense of it, his story was he was simply going back and reclaiming a benefit that wasn't included in his paycheck. That was his logic. That was the story that he knew. And in fact, I can't tell you how many other fathers and sons were out along that track with us every weekend. It was a father-son activity. Not the kind that most of us remember. But that's my fond memories of my father and those sorts of things. Now, one day when we were doing that, I remember looking across the tracks and seeing a man with a white hat coming towards us. I always knew that my father wore a blue hat. So I knew this white hat was something different. And in fact, by the way he walked, by the sort of surety in his step, by the sort of direction that he was taking, as a 7th grader, I figured, oh, my father wears a blue hat because he's an unskilled laborer. This man wears a white hat because he has more power. Now, I didn't have that language, but I knew that this was someone we had to watch out for. Well, as he approached, he called my dad over. I still remember him saying, Jerry, step over here. The chainsaw was still running, and I was, thank God it was, because I didn't want to hear what was going to happen. I knew that this guy was going to say something bad. We might get in trouble. In fact, what ended up happening is for the second time in my life, by grade 7, I went to jail with my dad that day. Not for my doing, but obviously for my father's, my complicity in it. Which reminded me, it was my second time to jail. By grade 7, Again, thanks to the internet and trying to remember. An old postcard. Hi, wish you were here. You don't know what that place is, do you?
Penitentiary.
The Lancaster County Prison. Kind of an interesting old postcard. Hi, wish you were here. Obviously someone's sense of humor. Someone who didn't have a father who went to that prison. I remember going there with my father when I was 5 years old. Remembering our stories. You're probably familiar with the West African notion of Sankofa. This idea of go back and get it is essentially how it translates. It's a notion that I've been playing with as I think about the power of story, and for us, sometimes we have to go back and get it. Those stories from our childhood, those stories from our earlier lives. Because interestingly, this past fall, I was on the negotiating team at Cincinnati State as we undertook a very contentious labor negotiation, which ended up in a strike with our faculty. I thought there I was, sitting with a white hat on. All those things that my father would have hated. All those things that I hated growing up. I didn't want to be a white hat, but there I was. Somehow, I had become a white hat. How did that happen? It's forced me to kind of think, where did my stories come from? What story am I living into today? Am I a white hat? Am I a blue hat? Is there some mesh of hats? Do I have to wear a hat? I don't know, but this raised a lot of questions for me. This notion of remembering our stories. Just a little bit more on this. As I said, in our life, we grant membership to many people into our stories, these significant characters. Our mother, our father, our significant other. Might be past, might be present, but their voices are influential. My father's voice, that unheard voice, just simply wearing a blue hat, and how much that has affected my views of labor, much more than any MBA course I could have ever taken about labor relations. That's where my story came from, if I'm honest with myself. So think of this. Who are those people that we grant membership to in our stories? And as we have these remembering conversations, they provide us with a gift, an opportunity to consider revising our memberships. Think of this. This is a radical notion, because we tend to think whether those parents, those teachers, those significant others, it's why we stay in abusive relationships. It's why we have dysfunctional relationships with our parents and our colleagues. We don't understand our own power to remember that maybe we need to upgrade some memberships. Maybe we need to downgrade others. We have this opportunity to say who needs to be part of our story. We have that authority, that authorship ability. It is ours. Sometimes we have to disqualify other voices. Provides us an opportunity to revision the memberships. And someone already hit on this opportunity to reconstruct our identity. So think, in 7th grade, after 2 trips to jail with an alcoholic father, what do you think my sense of identity was? I was told pretty clearly at school I was an at-risk kid. I was the kid from the other side of the tracks. I was on a dead end, given that my father was an unskilled laborer. Maybe I could get a job at the mill when I got older if I was lucky. Those were the stories that I was told, and that I believed. Maya Angelou has a wonderful quote: "There's no greater burden than carrying an untold story." 30 years ago, I couldn't have told you that story. It was a story of shame. It was a story of illegality. Today, I've come to realize it shapes who I am. It shaped my view of labor. It shaped my view of what's right. It shaped my view of my father and me, the kind of father I want to be. And in fact, that story, when I started thinking about it 25 years ago, was about the illegality of what my father did. Today, I think, wow, as a single father, dealing with the demons he was dealing with, $30 for that firewood. It was that important for him to break the law to make sure that we could sleep in a warm house at night. I'm not justifying what he did, But there's a different story that I tell myself today about that. So I guess I ask you, particularly as you sit here at a beginning place, that new beginning of your doctoral studies, what's the burden that you're carrying? Those stories, those untold stories that you might give voice to in your doctoral research, the stories that you might tell that might free you. There's this tension. I hope I've played out this tension. Homo narrans on one side, story is really important. Garrison Keillor tells us, the cultural anthropologists tell us. I can tell it to me myself and believe it. But on the other hand, we're living in a culture that might be a bit dismissive of stories. How do we reconcile that tension? We're not going to try to resolve that today, but I am going to ask you 3 questions here today. This is the first one. How can story be a resource for you as you seek to create community? My assumption is that as educational leaders, that you probably at least implicitly embrace that notion from Peter Block when he defines community. He says communities are experience of belonging. I think that's something that we probably share as educators, as educational leaders, that we believe how important community is. We have to create that experience of belonging. So how can story be a resource for you to create community, that sense of belonging? I want to stop here and ask you, as you reflect on this, as you reflect on some of the things I've said thus far, what might be stirring in you, particularly as you think about this question. What bubbles up for you? Maybe not so much answers to this question, but what wells up for you? Yes?
Well, you have a sense of understanding, what is important to individuals, and you can begin to use that as a resource, finding answers to problems and things that might go on.
Yeah, 2 wonderful things. Is it Sheila?
Yes.
2 wonderful things you say there. One about understanding. Story is a sense-making tool. It helps us make sense of what's going on around us. Helps us understand. And then you kind of jump to that piece about it might help us fix things. It might help us help. It might help us make things right. Helps us kind of engage with the community that we care about. And in fact, I'd probably even be a little bit more pointed, is that as we come to know our story, we come to know what matters to us. It becomes real crystal clear. What matters? What do I care about? Why am I fighting this fight? How much do I want to fight this fight? Because this is important. This is my story. This is what matters. Absolutely. Others? What bubbles up for you here as you think about this question?
I think about disenfranchisement. I think about conditions that people are born into without evaluating. Well, you have to evaluate the right and wrong of what someone is doing, but the priorities of the wood, the priorities of eating, the priorities of surviving, leads one to take a path maybe unethical, illegal, but conditions tell them in their minds that that's a necessity. When it may not be. It might be a way to get that $35, but you don't know it due to a lack of education, a lack of information.
Yeah.
You don't know how easy it was to get that $35. So since you don't know, and you take the path that you do know.
Yeah. Let me even play with that a bit more. Not just disenfranchise the way you're speaking into it there, but also if we don't create spaces where people's stories can be heard and told, we're disenfranchising them, right? Their stories cannot be heard, they cannot be told. We don't know how to help them, we don't know how to connect. We can't enter a relationship.
I find it interesting how the same story, you get different things from the story when you're 10 years old, and when you're 40 years old, and then when you're 60 years old.
Absolutely.
It's amazing. The same story, just like you're telling me about your father, and what you thought the story was at 10 years old versus the story you think of as now. It's the same story, but the whole meaning of the story is completely different.
Yeah. And to me, it's a really important piece about why we need to be conscious and deliberate about coming back to our stories. Otherwise, I keep telling that story from 25 years ago. That isn't the story of today. That's the story of 25 years ago. If I continue to believe that story, I'm a bitter son with a terrible father. That's the story that I tell. Today it's a different story. I'm a proud son. And in fact, I know what I need to do different as a father today because of the lessons and because of the courage.
Yeah, you'll probably see the story different 20 years from now, too.
Yeah. Jonathan, was there one?
Yeah, David Travis says, my concern is how far we go about remembering our individual story. If we begin to look at our past in order to define or write our story, we do not always remember our past perfectly, so we might fill in the blank spots with positive or negative sections to make our story sound better.
Yeah, and the name there again, Jonathan?
David Travis.
David, an absolutely wonderful point. And I would say to that, yes, that stories are not remembered perfectly. In fact, the beauty of story is that we do just that. We have to fill things in. I'm not quite sure how much of that is true that I told you in terms of the exact details. It's 30, 35 years ago. But it's the story I remember. That's the best I can do. And in fact, sometimes some of these stories might be so painful that it's better that we don't remember certain details. We block things out. We've told ourselves a different story. There is absolutely that sense of imperfection. And I'd also say that's the beauty of story, is the imperfectness of it.
At the heart of this whole approach to storytelling is the revelation that storytelling in terms of knowledge engenders an entirely different epistemology that the social sciences want us to confirm, want us to have.
Absolutely.
And the problem is that, and this is very important for education institutions, because we come in, we want objective data, we want to follow a scientific method, and by this we say we get it by disinterestedness, observation. But that's not the way you know people. By observation, I can know certain things about you, how tall you are, how old you might be, what sex you are, and unless you're in the village, and things of that sort. But if I really know you as a person, a different kind of epistemology kicks in. And it's not observation anymore, it's revelation. If you didn't tell me your story, I wouldn't know you. I could sit here till hell years old and observe you, I would not know you. And the problem is we tend to stick to this sort of objective approach, which is in fact antithetical to what we're trying to do in the community.
Yeah. I love being back with a group that uses words like epistemology. It doesn't come back off my tribe. Absolutely right. And that's why up front I tried to declare to you what my assumptions are. Because if you don't believe those assumptions, it takes you in a different direction. This isn't right or wrong. It's simply a different epistemology, a different mental model, a different framework.
If you don't reveal yourself to me, I'll never know you, no matter how much I observe you. And so the whole thing comes from revelation. Now, this is why I like the phenomenological approach for research, because we let the other person say what this event means to them, and we get to know them that way.
Let me give one more here, Jonathan, to the...
Constance Beatel, faculty member, asks, stories and narrative take time. How do we as educators create the space and time for each student's narrative?
Yeah, it's the biggest concern I hear time and time again. I do a lot of consultative, I do a lot of narrative coaching with executives. It's the piece you hear repeatedly. Stories take time. Now, let me turn this on its head a bit. How many characters do you get in Twitter? Like about 104 or so, isn't it? Yeah. Now, it's interesting because many people will tell me, particularly people of my age and older, will say, oh, Nick, we've got this inundation of technology. The technology's, not letting us tell stories anymore. We're just so consumed. My response is I'm not so sure. Because in fact, kids and adults are telling stories. Telling them a bit shorter in those 104 characters or so. Maybe not the richness and the depth that we know about. And in fact, it's spurring some revolutions of sorts about how to go back and mine tweets to build stories. These movements are really interesting if you watch what's happening out there with social media today. And we think the technology is kind of contributing to destorification, but I'm not so sure. In fact, let me give you one concrete example. Has anyone ever heard of caringbridge.org? I have a friend who's dying of brain cancer right now. When I was faculty at the University of St. Thomas, I also knew a student who was dying of brain cancer. And she was connected to caringbridge.org. Essentially, it's a website that allows patients who are terminally ill or severely ill to blog and report their illness and their coping with the illness, and for their loved ones to connect with them. And that sort of defies what we tend to think about with something like death, doesn't it? We tend to think that it needs to be this intimate face-to-face interaction. But yet, here's a website that allows, when I was at the University of St. Thomas, a young woman from Chile who didn't have people in Minneapolis, but she had friends all over the world, particularly back in Chile, to relate to her, and for her to relate to them right up until her death through technology. So I just think I would caution us when we think about social media and its role. I think it might actually have a potential to enable greater storytelling. I share the skepticism, but I also think we need to be open, because there's a lot of things that we just don't quite know yet that are being formed there.
One of my thoughts in terms of storytelling, that many times I work with real estate, and many people say that they can't afford to do certain things because they feel they don't have the money. Like one of the things may be to move into a certain neighborhood where the school might be better and it's better for their children, but they can't afford to be there. But my response is always that you can't afford not to be there, because you're going to pay the price, and you're probably going to pay a greater price by not being there. If you sacrifice, you can be there. I say that in relationship to the storytelling, that we may think that you don't have enough time to listen to that story, but you don't have enough time not to listen to the story. It's a priority.
Yeah. Let me give you one last example. Right here in Cincinnati, in my last 12 months of having moved here, I've discovered something called No Theater. It's live improvisational storytelling. That didn't come about just because some actors and directors thought it was important. It was because the community of Cincinnati said, we have stories we want to tell. It's a totally new form of theater where you and I, as untrained professional actors, say, I have a story I want to tell. And I stand on the stage and prepare an unrehearsed, not script, but story that I share with the audience. No Theater. True Stories is what it's called. Tiling, a German name for story, has also emerged here in Cincinnati. Every month it travels to a different place. Same principle. You and I as citizens, we want our story to be heard. And it creates a forum, a stage for stories to be told. In fact, about 6 months ago, Sweden established a ministry of storytelling. Along with the Ministry of Finance and Education and all those things, a ministry of storytelling at that high level, because they think Swedish society will become a better society through better stories being told amongst the people. So again, paying attention to these things that are happening out there, there's a movement occurring. Stories are becoming valued, more important in our lives. I'm going to shift this off this question. I kind of led you into this question. This one I'm going to kind of go backwards because it really differs in just one aspect. How can, not story, but how can your story be a resource for you to create community and a sense of belonging? I'm going to move you through this one, and we'll come back to questions again at the end. But this one, again, not just how can story, how can your personal story be a resource for you? Now, let me ground this first in some academics, and then we'll kind of move to the practical side. The Academy of Management Executive a few years ago had a great meta report that essentially reported this. The synopsis was, the primary source of learning to lead is experience. They looked across thousands of research articles about how do we learn to lead. And what they found is experience is the #1 factor. If you think about it, stories are lived before they're told, right? Stories come from experience. So this, to me, makes a connection here. If experience is at the heart of it, experience is that grist that our stories come from. Now, connected to that is this. The Center for Creative Leadership, CCL in North Carolina, did some very similar research, and I call this the 50-20-20-10 finding. They asked, where does the most effective leadership learning occur? And what they found, 50% of the most effective leadership learning is from experience. Very similar to the Academy of Management finding, from experience. 20% from a subset, a very specific kind of experience called hardship and failure. So think of that. 20% from our failing. But yet how much do we go back and try to harvest that and try to make sense of it? Usually that's the stuff that we try to put under the rug and ignore and make stories about why it wasn't a failure versus celebrating the failure. The other 20 from mentorship, the last 10. What is the least effective leadership learning?
Textbook.
Yeah, classroom, traditional classroom, the four walls of the institution. But yet, that's where we always march people off to, right? That's where we take them, because as educators, sort of the story we've been told, and we unquestionably follow that learning occurs in a classroom. But yet, the research tells us something totally different. So you've got things like the Academy of Management Executive, you've got CCL talking about the importance of experience, which also tells us about the power of story. You get accounts, narrative accounts, from people like Bill George, the former CEO of Medtronic, in his recent book, True Stories, which was also detailed in a HBR article. What he found? The effective practice of leadership requires learning from our life story. What a wonderful place you sit in today at the start of this doctoral journey, an opportunity for you to learn from your life story. What type of a leader are you? What type of a leader are you becoming? What is it that you care about? What's important? What's your story? That's the first question you need to be answering. Now, I'm going to share with you a little bit more about my life story. Not because my life story holds anything in and of itself, but to maybe inspire you to think about your story in the same way that I've reflected about mine. Now, can you tell what this is up here on the screen? Tracks. Now, if I were to say that I was from the other side of the tracks, would you know what I'm talking about?
Yes.
We all know that analogy, right? Being from the other side of the tracks. I've given you a little bit of hint. When I was 5 years old, my mother died. My father was around and not around. I had been in and out of emergency foster care my whole life up until about grade 9. And in fact, I've been homeless twice. I was a kid from the other side of the tracks. I had lived in 12 different homes by the time I was in grade 7, in 12 different communities. But being from the other side of the tracks, if you're from the other side of the tracks, you usually don't know it until you venture out to the other side of the other side of the tracks. And there's where I realized that not every other kid had an alcoholic, abusive father. That not every other kid had a stepmother who was severely mentally ill. That not every other kid lived in poverty or stole from the factory. But it was when I ventured out to the other side of the tracks that I realized that in some ways I was unique. And in fact, I remember quite vividly going before a judge with a social worker and a lawyer by my side in grade 9. And I remember the judge asking, Nick, we think we want to take you out of your father's home. And what he was essentially saying, I was going to be made a ward of the state. I didn't have that language. All I heard was taken out of your father's home. And as you know, probably a lot of the people you work with, maybe even your own stories, I had mixed feelings. It was my father. Despite all the mess, he was my dad. So leaving that mess had some consequences to my heart and elsewhere. But on the other hand, I knew I was living in mess. And I wasn't going to be able to be successful. I was already going down a track of drug and alcohol issues and a whole lot of other things that were happening in my life that I knew weren't going to allow me to be successful. But at the end of the day, the judge said, Nick, you're going to go away to a school called the Milton Hershey School. It's in Hershey, Pennsylvania. I knew a little bit about it from a distance. I wasn't quite sure what it was, but I knew it was a place that you went to live, kind of a residential school. So that day, a new story began to emerge for me. There was an ending occurring. There was a new beginning emerging. But that day was a big, messy neutral zone, standing in front of a judge with a lawyer and a social worker, and knowing that I wasn't going to live with my father anymore. The place that I ended up going was to the Milton Hershey School. You know, in the West, we have a narrative sort of structure that's three parts. In the beginning, which I just told you, and then here at the end, kind of the happily ever after, or at least we hope it is. And what always happens in the middle of any story? Conflict. Yeah, that's what makes a story work. There's some type of conflict or tension that needs resolved. For me, that conflict or tension climaxed in front of the judge. What began to emerge was a solution, a resolution to that conflict. That was my then one day coming to the Milton Hershey School. Now let me ask you this. Has anyone ever heard of the Milton Hershey School? A few people. A few of you. Let me tell you a little bit of the story of Milton Hershey. Prior to 1900, he had experienced 3 bankruptcies. He had an 8th grade education. His mother apprenticed him as a candy maker. And not until after the 3rd bankruptcy did he find success. He started a company called the Lancaster Caramel Company in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, that made caramel candies. And in 1900, he sold that business for $1 million. Think of that, 1900, that was pretty good money. He went just about 10 miles up the road to a place called Derry Township, D-E-R-R-Y, because it was rich in dairy, D-A-I-R-Y, that you need for no chocolate. So, 1900, he begins building what would become the world's largest chocolate factory. It still is today, or actually up to about 6 months ago it was. They've actually made plans to move production out of that facility. But for about 100 years, it served as the world's largest chocolate factory. He opened that factory around 1905. The company thrived, wildly successful. About 5 years later, in 1909, his wife Catherine, who you see pictured here, came to him. And she said, "Milton, we've got more money than we can shake a stick at." She said, "We should do something good with our money, our resources." And he said, "What are you thinking of?" She said, "What if we create a school for needy children?" He said, "Great idea." He's always attributed this. He said it was Kitty's idea. He called her Kitty. Her name was Catherine. But it's always been referred to as Kitty's idea. So in 1909, they established what was called the Deed of Trust, essentially a legal instrument that said, we're going to create this school. What's really interesting is the school was created in his home. Think about our busy lives. So CEO and founder of the world's largest chocolate company by day, by night, he opened up his doors for needy orphan children to come in. Those first children were enrolled, they were educated, lived in his home with them, and very quickly it began to expand. By 1945, when he died, there were almost 1,500 children enrolled at the school. 100% of their expenses were paid, 100% of their needs attended to, thanks to his generosity. Now, few people realize this because he wasn't a Ben & Jerry's kind of social marketer. He was very modest and humble. He came from a very humble Mennonite background. And in 1945, when he died, it was reported on the front page of the New York Times that he had willed the entire chocolate business to the school. In 1945, that was valued at $60 million. Today, it has grown to about an $8 billion trust. It's about the 5th largest trust in the U.S. It's a K-12 orphanage of sorts. I was very fortunate to have gone and graduated from that school. It afforded me a second chance in life. When I think about what did I take from that, it's this, that nobody can go back and start a new beginning. I was never going to resurrect my mother. I was never going to cure my father's alcoholism. I was never going to dig myself out of poverty. I had no chance of going back and starting a new beginning. But what I did realize is I could start that day on August 1st, 1980, when I went to that school to begin to write a new ending. And that's what I was told, and that's what I was believed. That was different than the stories that I was told prior to that, and the stories that I believed prior to then. In the end, because remember, that's how all stories end. There's some kind of resolution to this. Mine's obviously still a story in progress. But what I've come to realize, as I've been interested in stories from an academic standpoint as well as from a practitioner standpoint, and when I think about my own life, what have I experienced? Not what can some academic researcher tell me, but what have I experienced, is that we become the stories that we tell ourselves. Yes, the narrative therapists, the narrative theorists will tell us this too, but I've experienced this. We become the stories we tell ourselves. So think about this today. You telling yourself a story that you might make it through this doctoral study? Telling yourself that you're going to leave here with a doctoral degree? Or are you telling yourself that you're going to leave here and make a difference in this world because of your doctoral degree? What's the story that you're telling yourself here today? For me, I've come to realize that much like the care and love that Mr. Hershey has given to almost 8,000 children, which is the number of alumni who graduated from the school, I've learned how to give that care and love to my girls. And that's the key measure of my life. I love my work, but family is number one by far. Work's down there at 2 or maybe 3. Not to say I don't love it and put a lot of time and energy and effort into it, but at the end of the week, I better say that this is where my energy and attention has been focused. And that was taught to me by Mr. Hershey's philanthropy, servant leadership, and the love and care that he gave to 8,000 children. Now, why do I believe this notion of we become the stories we tell ourselves? 2 things. One, Arlene referred to this. I've kind of latched on to this word, possibilitarian. It really just sounds like an awesome word, doesn't it? Kind of has some oomph behind it. A lot of people who I work with see it from the flip side. They say, oh, Nick's naive. You know, Nick sees the world through rose-colored glasses. Nick sees, everything as, glass half full. I say, yes. I'd much rather have those distinctions than on the other side. Sometimes I am a little naive, but I'd much rather give people a chance to believe in them, to trust in them. Not totally naive, but sometimes yes. But I do tend to think of myself as a possibilitarian. A few years ago, I had the great opportunity to go back to the Milton Hershey School, that place that had given me so much, and return something in favor and serve in an executive role at the school. And the president at the time was also an alumnus, John O'Brien. And John was one of my best coaches, mentors ever. And John, I remember, pulled us all together on the executive team, and he said, from this day going forward, he said, I do not want to hear anyone in this school ever refer to our children as at risk. And of course, there was a little bit of smirking and people thinking, oh, okay, this is just semantics or some word thing here. He said, going forward, any child who gets accepted to the Milton Hershey School, they've crossed the threshold. Now it's our responsibility to wrap our arms around them, whether you're a teacher, a house parent, a chaplain, a barber, whatever your role is. They only have one option, and that's success. We can only regard them as if they're at promise. Now, as a student, I knew this implicitly, because when I was there, people cared like you wouldn't believe. There was only one opportunity for me the day I walked in there. It was success, and I lived up to that. You know this in your own work, whether it's the people you work with, your own children. If you treat someone as if she's at risk, how's she going to behave? At risk. This isn't rocket science. We see it played out every day. But if you hold someone to be at promise, they will rise to that. I know it works for me. When my boss holds me to be at promise, man, I perform a whole lot better when he thinks I'm at risk. Think about this with your own lives. What if we began as educational leaders to think of the students who we work with as that promise. A few years ago when I was up at the Banff Center, this kind of came back and hit me in the face, that we had just hired a new director of literary arts. We had spent over a year doing an international search for one of the world's best literary arts people to head up our literary arts program. We had done work inside and out. We finally got down to the finalists. We finally got the lead person who we wanted. We made the offer. He came and joined us. A few weeks later, I was at a party, and I said, "Stephen, how's your family doing?" He said, "Oh, Nick, I didn't bring my family along." I said, "Why not?" He said, "Well, you know that contract, HR stuff." He said, "I'm on probation for the first 6 months." And he said, "I thought it was better to leave them back in Saskatchewan. And once I know that I've made it through the 6 months, we don't want to uproot the kids and stuff. And once I know I made it through, we'll bring them out." Wow, what a great job of holding someone at risk. We just went through all this work for a year and said, "This is the guy," but we're not really sure. In fact, we want to write a contract that explicitly states, "You're at risk. You're on probation. We're not sure you're the guy. We'll get back to you in 6 months." I just wonder how Stephen would have performed differently if his family was with him, if he didn't have those fears and concerns of family being away. Would have that been any different? I don't know, but I tend to think so. So again, being a possibilitarian. The second thing, Mr. Hershey has inspired me as a servant leader. I'm never going to give away $8 billion, but I can give away $8 billion of love and care and trust in people and hope for the future. He's given me that sense of wanting to make a difference in this world, however I can, to be a servant leader. And today I feel very blessed to work at Cincinnati State, a place where we are given first, sometimes second, sometimes last chances to our students, in much the same way the Milton Hershey School does. It's the kind of mission that I need to be part of. It's what I've been told. It's the story I believe in from Mr. Hershey, that I can make a difference by doing that. Now, a couple questions for you. Consider those stories that you've inherited. You've inherited these from your religion, from your church, your synagogue, your mosque. Master grand narratives from religion. You've inherited these stories from your family. Things that you do today because your mother told you that's the way you do it. You've never departed from that. Things that you've learned from others. These are inherited stories. They're not good or bad. They're the stories we've inherited. But how often do you question the validity of those stories? Remember back to remembering? Sometimes there's stories that just don't serve us anymore, but we tend to believe them. Whether it's a story about being a single mother, a story of being an adult child and alcoholic, a story of being an executive. Whatever those stories are, we've got to take time to question. To not necessarily throw everything out, but simply to question the validity. Are these things I still believe in? Do they serve me? And many of us have accepted these stories implicitly because of trusted sources. This was our rabbi. This was our father. This was our teacher. We need to ask ourselves, who do we authorize to tell our story? Because my story, when I've taken time to think about this, I've authorized some people that I shouldn't have authorized. And I tend to believe those stories. And it's only when I've remembered and realized I need to disqualify this person. This isn't serving me anymore. I need to elevate this one. I need to honor this perspective. So again, as you sit here at the beginning of your doctoral program, what are those stories that are going to allow you to be successful as a learner? Because again, this isn't the bachelor's or master's, this is your doctorate. This is going to take a lot of hard work. And there's probably been many people who've told you stories because of your gender, because of your race, because of whatever, that speak to whether you're going to be successful or not. Are you going to validate those stories? Are those the stories that are going to serve you? Or are there other stories that you've been told? People who you do authorize. I think it's an important piece for us to take time in our lives to think about, particularly where you are today. Now I want to come back to Mr. Hershey, because when I went back to the school to work there, it was right around the time leading up to the school's 100th anniversary, the centennial. We were beginning to do a lot of planning, even though it was a few years out. And I asked the school historian to serve as a coach for me, because I knew how important the school history was to the culture. And I said to Jim, Jim, I want you to meet with me every week, and I want you to tell me what happened on this week in the school over the last 100 years. Was it a football game? Was it someone got hired or fired? Was it, a big event, a fire that occurred on campus? Just so I can kind of track this week through history. I want to kind of really appreciate and understand. And the very first thing he did is he took me down into the bowels of the archives at the school. It was a dark, windowless basement, and he pulled out one of those old reel sound things, you know what I'm talking about? And he put it on, and it was a crackling sounding recording. Can you hear that crackly radio recording? It was from 1945. Mr. Hershey was about 88 years old, just prior to his death. And the radio interviewer said, Mr. Hershey, tell us about your vision for the chocolate company. And his response was this. He said, I never had a vision for the chocolate company. And he responded so quickly. And I remember sitting there and kind of leaning in to hear what was going to come next. Because being someone who's been trained in leadership, the story that I've always believed is vision is the most important thing a leader can do. And here's who I thought was a successful leader saying I never had a vision for the chocolate company. But his next response was this. He said, my vision was to solve poverty in America, one child at a time. He said the chocolate business was just a vehicle that allowed me to accumulate a lot of money that I could do something better with. Now, when I think about this, and when I talk to others about this, you might in some cynicism say, this was an 88-year-old man, he's sitting on his deathbed, of course this is his story. I don't know. But I do know he was courageous enough at 88 to say that it wasn't just all about making a bunch of money. And in fact, I know that he acted on this by creating the deed of trust, by creating the school. 100% of his assets went to the school, nothing to nobody else. So his vision probably was this, not just about a chocolate company, but about something else. And again, it reminds me, the piece I want to sort of stoke you with is this. As you think about this, what's your vision as you begin to think about leaving where you've come from into this doctorate program? A couple more things, and I want to save about 10 minutes or so for us to have some open conversation here. Alistair McIntyre, a political and moral philosopher, I love this quote of his. He says, I can only answer the question, what am I to do, if I can answer the prior question of what story do I find myself a part of? What story do I find myself a part of? I think the last two things I want to leave you with are this. Two questions. What can I learn from my life story? It's nothing you can figure out in a 2-hour keynote this afternoon. In fact, I've taken the better part of 30 years since leaving the Milton Hershey School trying to figure this out. It's going to constantly be made and remade, to your point. It's going to be different 2 years from now than where it was 2 years ago. But I'm constantly trying to take time to reflect and ask myself, what is it that I can learn from my life story? And most importantly for you, how can you lead from that life story? You've got amazing gifts and talents that have brought you to this place. How can you use those strengths from your story to shape the kind of future that you want to shape? So I think I'll stop there and see what kind of questions might bubble up and where you might want to go with that. So let me take a breath and hand it over to you. Questions, thoughts, as you think about story, particularly in a very personal way as it might relate to you as you sit here today on the cusp of a new beginning.
Nothing is there.
Not yet.
I'm okay with silence. Sometimes we just need to let things soak a little bit, see what wells up.
Again, from Constance Butel, how do we elicit not only the story, but the reflection, learning, and action it might deliver?
Is it Constance?
Constance Butel.
So how might we, can you just repeat that again?
How do we elicit not only the story, but the reflection, learning, and action it might deliver?
Yeah, I love those three pieces. So if we tend to think of this, we want to first elicit the story, right? But we need to create a vessel to hold that within. Because stories can be messy, right? Sometimes they kind of spill out over the edges, onto the floor. They get messy sometimes. So how do we create that vessel that can hold the reflection so we can begin to look back on the story and make sense of it? Because the story in and of itself is just a story. But when we reflect upon the story, it might lead to some insights. And I love the second piece of this is from those insights, how do we then move to action? And in fact, that's what, when you kind of bridge the arts world, the theater world, and the story, we begin calling enacting. How do we begin to enact that new story? Those are some deep, profound questions. And there's a lot of tools that we can use to help us move towards enacting. But one, first and foremost, has to believe, you have to believe that you can name that new story. And some of the work we do in coaching is helping people title it. What's the new story? So for you as doctoral learners, what's the title of the new story you're moving into? Because once you can title it, you can begin to move towards it. You have something to move towards. But often with the old stories too, we got to create distance, right? We need to be able to create distance from those old stories. Because those old stories may not have served us. So for example, if I'm a kid from poverty, an alcoholic father, a mentally ill stepmother, all of those things are suggesting that I'm not going to be successful in my education. And those are the stories I was told. I need to create distance from those stories so that I can begin to embrace a new story about success in school. Just two examples. Tell me more here. I see the furrowed brow, so that tells me there's a question.
Well, no, it's interesting when you say move from that, because I see it as stories connect the past to the present, and it creates growth for the future. So when you connect everything, you're learning maybe what you don't want to become, what you don't want your children to become, but also maybe even how can you take your father's experience and build that into something else for others. So that's where I see it all deals with connection.
Yeah, and I agree with you. The distancing is from the old story, not so much from the people, the events, but how do I distance myself from that story?
To not become that.
Yeah. But I love how you're connecting it. You have to take Sankofa, right? Exactly. The stuff from the past and bring it forward to the future.
Yes.
It's very interesting because the same story could be shared by multiple people. For example, you could have had 3 or 4 siblings experiencing the same thing, and their pathway may be totally different from yours. So the same story could generate different perspectives, and the stories are always going to change. The perception of the story is going to change. So it's just very interesting how people can different things can be derived from the same event.
And I can tell you it's exactly the case in my family. That the kids, literally from university, doctorate educated, a couple, to imprisonment, everything in between.
People gather different things from different events. I mean, some people can see the glass half full and half empty.
Yeah, and I surely don't believe it's a silver bullet of story. And I also want to acknowledge that an assumption that I'm making is that we have the power to change our stories. And I also want to acknowledge my cultural bias with that. That I know that there are some people who live in such oppression that they're not able to change their stories because there might be physical violence, there might be addiction, and things that do not allow them to cognitively able to envision that new story. So I know I say that from a place of privilege, and I feel very blessed and privileged to believe that I have the authority to change my story. But I do know that there are many people who do not have that. And I think that's a greater challenge for us as educational leaders. It's easy to work with someone like me who believes that. The greater challenge are the people who may not have the resources to imagine that. How do we help them?
Jonathan,
A thought from Kim Harris. This concept of story slash storytelling is universal. Excuse me, is universal and transcends in all cultures.
Absolutely. Different cultures, many of you know it, from the different cultures that you come from, that you work within. It manifests differently, and sometimes it needs to be approached radically differently. You can't just kind of say, oh, we're going to tell a story. As you know, that doesn't work in every culture. And in fact, even in our Western culture, if I'm telling stories with bank executives, that looks a whole lot different than if I'm working with, a community aid agency, in the inner city. How stories are told, what's told, how we enable them, how we move them towards action. But yes, there is surely a universal element that probably speaks to that homo narens kind of aspect. Is there something deep within us that yearns for stories, that differentiates us?
In your daily life as a dean and as a faculty member, how do you manage your daily work and responsibilities as a dean and be able to have enough time in that 20-hour day or 18-hour day to have time to think about this or to reflect on your story?
I'll just give you a very concrete example. I know that if I try to say, oh, the story stuff's over here and the work stuff's here, work always wins, right? Culture always dominates, it eats, story for breakfast, so to say. But for example, this week, we have a faculty development session where we're bringing in a woman from Minneapolis, Barbara McAfee, who does wonderful work with voice. She's a songwriter and singer, and part of our ongoing faculty development is around story. How do faculty come to know their voice? How do they come to give voice? How do they come to have courage and, be able to believe that? So, I try to weave it in a way that, it's part of everything we do, from faculty development to the coaching that I do. So when people come in, I tend to look at, a faculty's concerns through a narrative lens. And usually what I find is that they're stuck. They've been telling themselves a story, whether it's about me, whether it's about the administration, or whatever. They're stuck in something. They need to find a new story. So my approach to problem solving, to coaching, is usually through that narrative lens. So whether it's in that, whether it's in the faculty development, I try to weave it as much as I can. My experience has been, if I try to, Fridays from 3 to 5 is my story time, it gets filled in with all kinds of other stuff. But if I tend to believe it's part of my day-to-day work. And in fact, I tend to think of myself that in any leadership role, but particularly in a dean role, that one of the greatest roles that I have is as a listener. I need to constantly be asking the faculty what's going on and learning from them and listening to those stories. It's kind of back to the narrative medicine, right? If I am not listening, I don't know what the issues are. That if I need to intervene, diagnose, or treat the organization, to borrow that medical terminology, I better be listening. Otherwise, my diagnosis and intervention is going to be misplaced.
When somebody tells you a story and you disagree with the story, do you judge them, or how would you change the story? So say somebody came to you with a story that you said you just don't have the ability to work in the story. How do you go about changing the story, or you don't make a judgment on it?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because there absolutely are those times when you kind of roll your eyes and you go, oh my gosh, they didn't get it, or they don't understand.
But it's their story.
Absolutely. And there's some times that I fail miserably at that. That I want my story to win because I know it's the story. And I
well, how do you stop yourself from judging them or changing?
Yeah. I guess I'd say in honesty, sometimes I do and sometimes I don't. Okay. It's an ongoing challenge. But I think I try to, at the end of the day, be able to step back and reflect. And from time to time, I've had to go back and say...
Yeah, there's a lot of commercialism out there, people who have other agendas who are trying to sell you on their story. And people buy into it. for one reason or another. And I see that all the time. I disagree with it, but
Yeah. It's a technical term, but a former boss told me that we all actually had pretty good bullshit meters. And I think what he taught me there is something that I do know, and you know that we usually know it when someone's telling us a story that, you know, some accuracies may not be quite there. We need to be courageous enough to call those, right?
I see it all the time when I go to meetings. I mean, I see people present stuff, and they're presenting information that may have been successful to them, but only 1 in 100, and they're presenting it as fact. When in fact, when I go back, I try it, it doesn't work for me. But other people will buy into it completely.
There is a bit of a platinum rule that I personally have, and it's to assume positive intent. This kind of comes back to the possibilitarian. So that means there's times that I find that I'm attributing motivation where I shouldn't be. You know, it's like, I know what he's up to here. Well, chances are I'm attributing motivation that doesn't. If I assume positive intent, my experience is that 98% of the time, there aren't evil people out there. People want to do the right thing. They may have convinced themselves of stories that aren't in fact true, but they're usually trying to do the right thing. And if I believe that, it usually creates a better starting place than me, you know, trying to deny their story. Anything else out there? Yep, Jonathan?
Valencia Dublin states, some people, particularly those with a difficult past, are afraid or ashamed to tell their stories. How do we as educators encourage students to take strength from their stories and to willingly share?
Was it Victoria?
Valencia.
Valencia, I think the key thing that I've found is to serve as a role model. I can never expect others to share stories with me unless I am not courageous in telling my story. So some of what I'm doing today, again, is not that I think my story holds anything for you so much in and of itself, but hopefully my courageous telling of that story might translate to you to say, you know what, I need to be courageous in finding my stories and telling them, again, in the appropriate audiences where it's going to matter. But I think first and foremost with students and people who we interact with, we need to find those cracks. You know, those places where Leonard Cohen said the light comes in, those little cracks where our story can connect with another human being. It's in those cracks where we choose to be vulnerable, where we choose to show a little bit of our true selves, and we choose to connect with a story, no matter how hard those stories might be to tell. It's usually there where the most beautiful things blossom. That's what I'd share, Valencia.